Hi, welcome to the bathtub. This is the master bather, Scott Bradfield. I'm able to start this talk off with less theatrical, all the great Barnum and Bailey style theatrics that usually mark the opening of my shows, where I have music and dogs and nothing works. I've done everything wrong. So today I don't need to do any of those things. I'm going to do a few of these. All I have for special effects is I have my martini in a floral patterned glass, just the way Dashiell Hammett drank. And I'm going to do like three of these, like really fast. They're all going to be very short, and as inexpert as I can make them. The first one I'm going to be really inexpert at, first I'll say why I wanted to do this. You can see my backdrop of all my books, and there's lots of kind of series. You can see Borges, and you can see Clark Ashton Smith, and then you can see Jack Kirby comics, and you can see Library of America series, and you can see sort of Iris Murdoch, The Godfather. And oh my God, there's our BK Smiths. I can't put it up. There's our logo, and for the IBA, International Bathing Alliance, which is still free, 2-for-1 free lifetime memberships for you and a bathing buddy. Just send me your name, a location. I put you on the map, and you're entitled to read books in the bathtub anywhere in the universe, as long as the universe exists. So you see all these books. There's lots of interesting things. I occasionally people will say, "Oh, I see you did so and so. You have so and so. You should do that on the bathtub." And I think that's great. I love that people paid enough attention to this miserable excuse for a literary chat program to actually suggest things. That's terrific. Thank you. But the one that seems to have caught more eyes, I've gotten about 7 or 8 people have written me or emailed me asking about Carl Barks. Uncle Scrooge books. I've been buying these as they came out, and several people. The last one was a guy named Matus. I pronounced his name wrong. He's in Poland. He's in the International Bathing Alliance. You can look him on the map. He's a celebrity now because he's on the map. And he said, do Carl Barks. Another person said, you got to do Carl Barks. Every time I mention Carl Barks, 2 or 3 people say, oh yeah, I get emails. Yes, you should do Carl Barks. No one talks to me otherwise. But Carl Barks really strikes a chord in a lot of people. And I'm not going to be able to explain why. I'm going to be totally an expert at this because it's not somebody I know really well. But I like most people who read Carl Barks, I read him as a child, not knowing who he was. So the Uncle Scrooge comic books, which started when I was, they were around when I was just 2 or 3 years old. And these would be some of the very first things I ever read. Okay, there's a. I'm trying not to use the word iconic, by the way. Don't let me use the word iconic anywhere in this talk or ever. There's a kind of typical type of Carl Barks picture that's actually more busy than most of the covers. They had the Uncle Scrooge. He did 2 sets of comics for Gold Medal. I'm going to get this wrong. But for this line of comics, there's a little more traditional, but they're often really simple. That's a little more like the stuff I remember. He's just skating, and when he skates, everything with him is money, dollar signs for Uncle Scrooge. He's basically Scrooge from the Christmas Carol, Ebenezer Scrooge, only a comic character who's you sort of like in a way, and all he cares about is money. Now, those little comics for like 10 cents were often reprinted and printed in cheap reprint editions, and I don't know which ones I read. But in the 50s and 60s, these are like pre-linguistic pleasures. When you read a Carl Barks comic, his name was not on any of these old books. So Uncle Scrooge are the ones he's best known for, but he also did a lot of Donald Duck series of comics. And I'm sorry, I know it. I just looked it up, but I forget who it was. Dell Comics published these. Someone you wouldn't normally be paying attention to. He did the Donald Duck comics for Walt Disney. And when he did these comics, he did everything in them for many, many years. He did the covers, he did all the stories, he did all the art, and his name was nowhere in the comics. I don't know the history because there's actually not a good biography of Carl Barks. That's one thing I learned as I was kind of nosing around this past week. is there really isn't a good one. There's a little 2-page one in the back of these Fantagraphic editions, and you can get a little thing on Wikipedia. He was a West Coast man who had a very strange life. He seemed to live on farms. He lived in Oregon, lived in rural Oregon. He lived in all over California, up around San Jose. I want to say he was in Goleta for a while, and he worked. He started off as a self-styled cartoonist. He worked for a lot of I think even kind of odd publications before he got a job working at Disney, doing kind of slave work that a lot of the artists did out there. And then he somehow got himself a job working on these comics. And when he started working on them, he just wrote all of them, wrote everything, just managed them, inked them, did everything, I guess. Maybe not inked them, don't. And he took this Donald Duck character, who I don't know if you feel, I don't have any fondness for the Donald Duck character cartoons. I'm not a fan of the Walt Disney cartoons, really. As a little kid, I liked them. But even if you don't like Donald Duck and that silly voice of his, the books and the comics are not at all like those cartoons. And they're a lot more interesting. Okay, so if you start to get interested, it's get a little confusing because Fantagraphics normally does really great work. And they always do great work. But I'm a little confused sometimes by the way they're doing the Karl Barks. I first got to know Fantagraphics by these wonderful editions of Peanuts. I grew up with Peanuts, and I know these inside out. I must have read every Peanuts cartoon 100 times, particularly as growing up. And what they did is they did them in 2 years. So each volume had 2 years of cartoons in sequence from all the daily papers. So they ran them in sequence, and you could actually read through them, and nothing's missing, and there's some great introductions. And they would do 2 of these a year. I used to get them for my son, and me and my son used to read these all the time. And my wife and I read them now. So they did those, and I think they've completed that series, or they're near the end of it. They've done a number of things in the Prince Valiant series, but they started doing the Donald Duck stuff about 8 years ago, and I started buying them up. And they're a little more confusing the way they're laying them out. So they're trying, as I understand it, they're trying to lay them out as Barks wrote them, and then they're doing some restorative work, which is wonderful, and they're restoring a lot of the panels that were lost for various reasons, or showing alternate panels, and there's some background stuff in the back. But basically, they're not running them as the comics ran themselves, which I kind of find confusing. So, for example, they don't just show that whole comic and then show you what was in that comic. They're laying out from over the years, and they're kind of jumping around from different comics. It doesn't really interrupt the pleasure of reading them, but it sometimes gets me a little confused as far as where which cover fits with which book. Okay, so the Donald Duck cartoons, comic books, are for the most part, from the ones I've been reading over the past few years, and they come about, I think they're doing 2 or 3 of these a year. They're not doing these in sequence. This is another confusing part. The Snoopy, the Peanut stuff were always coming out in sequence. These came out, and I think they still haven't done the first 5, and often the earliest Scrooges are considered some of the best and the much more livelier ones. But the Donald Duck comics are one set of comics, and then the Scrooge stuff. The Scrooge stuff tends to. Now those are all, the Donald Ducks are almost all 10-page comics. So it's short narratives, really, really well put together. So we start off with an idea. They're like little Simpsons episodes. They're perfectly composed and structured little stories. It was an interesting opening. The important thing to remember is when you look at them, you think, oh God, it's almost like a child. It is for children in a way. But the narrative skill, you look at the water. Every time Barks does, you see the boat. He has lots of scenes with water and deserts and landscapes, which always just seem perfect. So those are like 10-page. But when you get into the Scrooges, you'll get into much longer pieces. And he did 20, 25-page adventures. And those are the ones as a kid I really remember. Uncle Scrooge going off to discover the 7 cities of gold, or going off to discover something or other, Shangri-La, or going to the Klondike to find gold. And some of those are just, as a kid, they just stuck in my head. And when you go through some of the people who write introductions to these volumes, like George Lucas, you can see visual influences on the Indiana Jones movies, particularly. They have pictures of these kind of in these sort of simplistic traps, these simplistic mountain landscapes with big boulders about ready to fall on top of you. And the central character of Scrooge McDuck is the thing. I don't know why it was so interesting as a kid, but this is a very typical panel here. When you see those pictures as a kid of Scrooge McDuck in his money room, just covered in money. He just likes to bathe in the money, fishes in the money, swims in the money. That's all he cares about. So he's basically, Donald Trump on steroids, turned into a comic character who you're supposed to kind of like. He's just totally selfish. All he cares about is money, and that's all he cares about making. And everything he does is making money. They're fairly innocent stories, so he's often going off. There's lots of journeying, and I remember this as a kid. And as I reread these comics in the past, over the past few years, but a lot in the last week, they're still charming. They're still completely involving. There's very little exposition, so you see it's almost all dialogue and camera shots. And some of the camera angles are great. He skips exposition brilliantly. There's one that I really liked when you have there's a bunch of pack rats. I think it's this one. Yeah, the pack rats. And they're going off looking for gold. I forget the frame at the moment, but they're off and they're looking for some gold that's missing, and they find out pack rats have been taking them. And every time they turn around, the pack rats are bringing them little bits of gold and stealing like a watch or a toothpaste or something. You never see the pack rats. You don't see them once until you get to the very end of the story, and then you see the little pack rats munching whatever they stole from them. Every story has some sort of like a narrative brilliance to it. So Barks' stuff was unsigned, but a lot of people started to recognize and love these comics. They really stuck in imaginations. And again, the people who write me asking, we'll talk about Carl Barks. They're every possible age, every country. Like I said, the last guy I wrote was from Poland. Everybody who's read these, particularly as a kid, they never get out of your head, and they still reward you when you go back to them. I don't know if I want to talk too much more. It's gone on a little bit further than I wanted to. The central characters usually aren't Donald or Uncle Scrooge. It's usually Huey, Dewey, and Louie. And as I understand from these little background stuff, he invented those characters. Those are Carl Barks' inventions, Huey, Dewey, and Louie. And them in the Junior Badger Club or something. There's one where they learn how to call animals, and the whole story is based around the fact that they call these animals. And everywhere they go, different types of animals start showing up. The Last Crown of Genghis Khan, I think that's supposed to be a Yeti. I can't remember now. Anyway, I read all these over the past few years. I can't put them in sequence. I can't say anything clever about them, except to say that they're really, really charming comics, particularly for little kids. But everyone who's read them, you can't forget them for some reason. They really opened up a world to me when I was a little kid. Like, you wanted to get on planes and go places because that happened in Uncle Scrooge. You wanted to go to Tahiti, or you wanted to go to Indonesia because Uncle Scrooge went there and he went on a plane. There's something about the visuals. He goes to Saudi Arabia. What does Uncle Scrooge says? I used to sell lawnmowers. To Bedouins. It's in the sand. He sells people. He sells ice to Eskimos, is the old joke. That's Uncle Scrooge. There's another typical one, diving into the money. And there's the Beagle Boys. They're the bad guys because they've got masks on. There's very little danger in these books. I don't remember no one threatens anybody physically. Even the Beagle Boys are like laughing about how they're going to steal all his money, but there's no guns, as I recall. No one ever threatens anybody. Maybe he gets tied up once or twice by bad guys. Often other people are just trying to get to the money before Uncle Scrooge gets to it, because they're always trying to find money in the stories. So you can't. There's no sort of violence or threat in any of the cartoons that I recall. They're wonderful books. They're Fantagraphics. They're not related to these people. They're great deals. It's like 20. I think they're $25 a volume when they come out. Sometimes they should all be in print. But I think you get them off for $20, $25. It might be less on Amazon or one of those places that we're not supposed to buy from. You can probably buy direct from Fantagraphics, and that would be the best thing to do. I get them sometimes secondhand, and they come out 2 or 3 times a year. You can't miss, especially if you have little kids. You could get them for little kids. If you read them as yourself as a kid, then you may find yourself collecting these as I am. You just meet people. The people you meet who love Uncle Scrooge will always surprise you. You'll just and it leaves an imprint. There's a charm. I think it sticks with you when you've read these books. Okay, I don't have anything clever to say about them. I really say go get them. Fantagraphics is really a publisher worth looking at if you want to see the old cartoons and the way they were and the real lovingly restored editions of these comics. And again, I get a little confused by the layouts of the stories and which ones are coming out and which issue. But that's my kind of I'm kind of an anal. I like to see the original comic. Okay, that's it for today. And we'll talk to you next week. I'm going to be the same martini for a couple of weeks because I gotta do all these tonight. Okay, happy bathing.